We will be meeting this afternoon with our second panel, our first one of which was God is Loving, and this afternoon we will be addressing the topic of loving God. One of our panelists, Shaykh Ternava, the Grand Mufti of Kosovo, will be arriving slightly late. He was at an alternative lunch, so he will be coming in midstream, but Professor Siddiqui will introduce him now. First of all, I'd like to introduce our moderator for this afternoon, Professor Dr. Muzammil Siddiqui, who is the chairman of the Fiqh Council of North America, adjunct professor of Islamic Studies and World Religions at Chapman University of Orange, California, and director of the Islamic Society of Orange County. Dr. Siddiqui was born in India in 1943. He received his Islamic education at Darul Uloom Nadwatul Ulama, Lucknow, India. He graduated from the Islamic University of Medina in Saudi Arabia in 1965 with a higher degree in Arabic and Islamic Studies. He received an MA in Theology from Birmingham University in England and a PhD in Comparative Religion from Harvard University in the United States. And we want to welcome and thank Dr. Siddiqui for his willingness to moderate our afternoon session.
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. In the name of God, the most merciful, the compassionate. Good afternoon. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah. It's really an honor to be here in this conference. I want to thank His Royal Highness, Prince Ghazi, and also the Director of Faith and Culture Center at Yale University, Dr. Wolf, all of you. We have certainly very privileged to be here together and talking and listening to each other and trying to understand each other. The world today is building walls, bigger and walls and thicker walls of separation. We have to break the walls and build the bridges. So this is an attempt to build the bridges of understanding. We have a wonderful panel, although this is immediately after lunch, but I'm sure that you will find this panel so interesting that you will keep awake and listen. We have 5 panelists. And the first one is Ayatollah Professor Dr. Seyyed Mostafa Mohaghegh Damad. He is the Dean of the Department of Islamic Studies, the Academy of Sciences of Iran, Professor of Law and Islamic Philosophy at Tehran University, Fellow, the Iranian Academy of Sciences in Iran, and former Inspector General of Iran. The second speaker is Professor Dr. David Ford, and David Ford is a Regius Professor of Divinity in Cambridge University, Cambridge, and Director of the Cambridge Interfaith Program, focusing on Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. And the third speaker is Professor Dr. Peter Kuzmić, who is the co-founder and director Biblical Theological Institute of Croatia, distinguished professor of missions and European studies, Gordon Cornwell Theological Seminary. Our fourth speaker is Rabbi Brett Oxman, who is an Orthodox rabbi, chaplain. He is a chaplain and command chaplain of the United States Strategic Command, Offutt Air Force Base in Nebraska. And finally, we have the fifth speaker, His Excellency Sheikh Naim Ternava, who is the Grand Mufti of Kosovo. 5 speakers, and we have about 1 hour and 30 minutes. I'm requesting each speaker to speak for 10 minutes. And I will remind you when you're in the last 3 minutes of your speech as a reminder. And finally, I'll give you the final note, which means intahal waqt, the time is over. So that I hope that you will stop at that time. The purpose is, I know it's very difficult to put everything together in 10 minutes, but the purpose is so we'll have some time for discussion. So we'll start with Ayatollah Mohaghegh Damad.
صلوا May God's peace be upon you. In the name of God, most gracious, and may we give praise to the God of heavens and earth, and may God's peace be on his prophets and messengers. The title of my word is the reality of the love of God. What is the reality of loving God? I've written my speech in English because I was thinking that I will have half an hour.
My time is only 10 minutes, so I'm going to brief it in Arabic only in 10 minutes.
The title is the reality of loving God. According to what is in the Quran, man bears the divine trust. It's a trust that in the beginning was given to the heavens and the earth and the mountains, but they refused to bear it, but man accepted it. God says in his holy Quran, he offered the burden of our deposit as an act of trust, but the mountains and the earth refused to bear it. Then man accepted it. Man was unjust and ignorant. The Iranian poet, the celebrated personality who lived in the 8th century of Hijrah, he said, the skies could not keep this trust. Yet the poor, insane me was struck with such a tough luck. And we would like to think and meditate about this trust. What was this trust? Trust, according to language and according to the meaning, is something that is given into a person's custody that will be returned to its owners when he asks for it. If the person returns it safely, then we would say that he was faithful, not violating. But if he refused to return it, then we would say that he violated the trust. It seems that from this verse that the trust that God wanted to give it to man was so valuable, so important, that to keep it was very, very difficult for anyone, to the extent that all the creatures of heaven and earth refused to bear it. They said we could not accept it. They apologized for not accepting it. But the last creation, man, the last creation and the first in rank, he was the being in which the entire creation culminated. He accepted this trust. This trust that was referred in this verse has a relationship to the meaning of dignity, which is mentioned in another verse where God says, we endowed the children of Adam with dignity and sent them out of the lands and seas and have given them superiority over many other creatures. Therefore, dignity, man has dignity because he bears the trust that God has given him. So therefore, we should ask then ourselves, what is this trust? Dear brothers and sisters, philosophers and Islamic wise men say that this trust is the intellect. But those who also, the Sufis, say that it's something else, and they express this trust by saying it's love, amity, or passionate love, ashq, passionate love. But according to the Islamic origins, and because I am one of the students of Islamic studies, and according from my Shiite tradition, I would like to express trust by another word, which I have not heard in these 4 or 5 days. I haven't heard this word here. This word is Al-wilaya, guardianship or loving worship. Guardianship. This word, well, I suggest that the translators must translate this word loving worship or loving guardianship. Loving guardian. And this word has been repeated in the Quran and Hadith, and in the Islamic thought there was a conflict since the first centuries regarding the different meanings, the conflict between intellect and passionate love. Some people say that love and passionate love is not compatible with intellect and thing. And there was one person, Abdullah al-Ansari, and after them there was a poet called Hafiz Shirazi, and his aim in the line of poet which we referred to in the beginning, he said that this luck came on me, I am the insane. The interpreters of the Quran, they think that God has revealed his beauty and his perfection to man, and when man saw the beauty of God and his perfection, he became passionately in love with God. And we have there is some contradiction here between love and passionate love. They say that love, it's a contradiction between love and intellect. The Sufists say that love is incompatible with intellect. But in this paper, in my word, I would like to say, does this have any meaning? What's the meaning of love without the intellect? What do we mean by loving God without knowing God? So I prefer to use loving guardian. That includes knowledge, intellect, that includes leader, guidance. Loving God is knowing God. Loving God is after knowing God, after being guided by God to know Him. God said in one of the things, guidance needs a counselor, and guidance needs someone to guide you, and loving guardian needs someone to guide, and that's one of the guardians of God. And this loving guardianship is a relationship between God and the intellect. God is the guardian of the believers, and the believers are saints of God. That's the meaning of loving guardianship. It's the relationship that is based on intellect, it's based on reason, it's based on knowledge. What's the meaning of love without being reasonable? I don't think love has any meaning. If loving God is according to inclination or instinct, it's like the love of the father to his children, or his children to their parents. The slave knows God and he loves God. This love has some meaning, but only after knowledge and after being guarded to that knowledge, guided to that knowledge. But if God is our Father and we are His children, and between father and children, there's a fathership relationship. Because there was one person who was called the insane, and he had passionate love towards a girl. There's poetry that says, if you ask this insane man, why do you love Layla, that girl, and Layla is not beautiful? He said, if you look into my eyes, you will not see except a beauty. I can see beauty in that girl who is called Layla. This is not what we mean by loving God. And I'd like to say I would like to say that loving God is knowing God Almighty, and love without knowledge does not have any meaning, and may God's peace be upon you.
Thank you very much, Ayatollah Mohaghegh.
المتكلم الثاني.
Well, my paper is called Loving God for God's Sake. And having been invited to speak on loving God, I was also asked to try to link it to each of the other 5 conference themes, and all in 10 minutes. So this probably allows for only one big thought, and that is what I'm going to offer to you. I ask myself, what is a core Christian theological affirmation that resonates deeply with all 5 themes of the conference, and also with Muslim devotion to God? And the conclusion is a question from the first chapter of the book of Job. Does Job fear God for nothing? The question asks, what motivates Job in his relationship with God? Is it what God gives him? Is it his wealth, his reputation, his family, his health, the reward for being pious, the satisfaction of a faith that gives meaning to life? In the book, Job's faith is tested radically. All of those incentives and more are swept away by his terrible affliction. The for nothing means for no reward, gratuitously. The Hebrew is hinam. The Septuagint Greek translation is dorian, as a gift. God is to be feared and loved. It is a commonplace of the spiritual traditions of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam that holy fear and overwhelmed, amazed awe are part of what it means to love the true God. But God is to be feared and loved simply because of who God is, for God's sake. Loving God, fearing God, obeying God, praising God, blessing God, all of these activities and more are done fundamentally, ultimately, and above all, for the sake of God's name, God's glorious, mysterious, and incomprehensible reality. If we rightly acknowledge God in faith, then, because of who God is, we are drawn to love God with our whole being, body, heart, mind, imagination, and will. For us in this conference on love, the core question might be, do we love God for God's sake? Relating to God for God's sake might be seen as a basic mark of mature faith that recognizes many names of God as being, first of all, God's names. The movement of faith is being attracted by God in infinitely rich, creative, and loving ways through the signs of Scripture, of creation, and of history. Because of this attraction, we acknowledge God as God and give ourselves to God in gratitude and love. Now, how does loving God for God's sake relate to God is loving, the theme of the conference we've already had? They are, I think, strictly correlated. Wholehearted, unconditional love is evoked and deserved by the one who is utterly love. In other words, loving God for God's sake is not arbitrary or unreasonable, but makes the deepest sense in the light of who God is. Job's suffering makes a God of love or justice almost unimaginable to him. And much of the discussion between Job and his friends in the book of Job is really about the character of God. At the end, the verdict of God delivered to one of the friends is, "My wrath is kindled against you and against your 2 friends, for you have not spoken of me what is right, as my servant Job has." Now, it's worth noting, how did Job speak of God that was right? It included passionate argument. It included radical questioning. It included cries of protest, refusing to accept that traditional answers, as interpreted by his friends, are applicable in his case. and it had lively theological speculation in wonderful poetry. That was what pleased God in Job's speech about God. And through all this, he shows this fundamental concern for God as God. The aim is not to get back his wealth, his reputation, and his children, but fundamentally to get God back. He is passing the test of fearing God for nothing. So what sort of God is this? Is it not a God who wants, above all, to be related to for his own sake? In relation to Job, God risks letting Job be tested to the limit in order to have that sort of gratuitous, free, for nothing relationship with him. This is perhaps the deepest secret of pure, holy love. It is not sentimental, but is utterly realistic about the terrible suffering, sin, and broken relationships that can happen. It is the love seen in the parable of the prodigal son, or the compassionate father in the New Testament. This love wants us to imitate it and to recognize, even in the face of trauma, that God is God and is to be loved as God for who God is. This is a love that images God's love. God's love is utterly free and self-giving towards the other for the sake of the other. God shows this love by inviting us into nothing less than the sort of love that God has and is. We are in God's image by being lovers of God for God's sake. Now, how does loving God for God's sake relate to loving neighbour? Job's breakthrough with God happens through God speaking to him out of a whirlwind with many unanswerable questions. There is a massive emphasis on creation being God's and having a created life of its own, not just being there for human beings. Is the wild ox willing to serve you? No. It is about creation for creation's sake, and it has an intrinsic value in relation to God who created it. Now, the 5 topics for this conference do not explicitly refer to the non-human creation. That's why it's nice to have these flowers here. The book of Job, other parts of the Bible, as well as parts of the Quran, together with the ecological and environmental crises of our world at present, all suggest that we need to be explicit about creation's importance for its own sake before God. Loving one's neighbour today must be especially concerned about the ecology, inseparably spiritual and material, that sustains the life of neighbours, including future generations of neighbours. The health of that spiritual and material ecology requires blessing God for God's sake and creation for creation's sake, in response to the ways that God blesses us and creation. It is an ecology of blessing, within which we bless and love our neighbour. Between God for God's sake and creation for creation's sake is the reality of humanity for humanity's sake. Human beings are created in the image of God to be delighted in, loved, honoured and blessed for their own sake. And this is the deepest root of human rights and responsibilities. Now, how does loving God for God's sake relate to speech? The shaping context of our speech, its most comprehensive environment, is our speech to God and about God, responding to the speech of God. Our scriptures give the classic authoritative forms of such speech, and our prayer, worship, teaching and proclamation constantly interpreted afresh. Among many thoughts on speech suggested by the book of Job, 2 are, first of all, that poetry is at least as important as prose. Most of the book of Job is poetry. How might Christians and Muslims engage with each other through poetry? Because most of the discourse of love, the greatest discourse of love, is of course in the form of poetry. Secondly, the grammatical moods of faith are vital. The language of faith is impoverished if it's only in the indicative mood, saying affirmations, this is so, that is so, God is this, or the imperative mood, do this, do that. Important though those 2 moods are, One of the problems with Job's friends, who are judged not to have spoken right of God, is that they speak largely in terms of definite affirmations and imperatives. Job, on the other hand, again and again uses the interrogative mood, asks questions, the subjunctive mood, explores things, perhaps, maybe, this, that, and the optative mood of desire. If only God would, this, that, and the other. And indeed, one might say that the embracing mood is that of desire, and that this is especially appropriate for any faith that is concerned with God's future, where everything cannot be wrapped up yet. One might say that in the 21st century, the world desperately needs faith like this, that is not just imperatives and indicatives, but is also questions and explorations and desires. Now finally, how does loving God for God's sake relate to world poverty? To love God for God's sake, to love a God of utter compassion, is to be moved by that compassion of God. Dealing with world poverty requires the deepest springs of compassion to well up. And it's about making the connection between, in Christian terms, the leading petition of the prayer of Jesus, hallowed be your name. What comes first is hallowing, sanctifying, or blessing of God as God, and the petitions following, your kingdom come, your will be done, a will of compassion. And above all, of course, with Jesus Christ, actually showing that compassion. And with the permission of the chair, I will simply end with a quotation from the Gospel of Matthew, in which Jesus uses that powerful word, esplangnitzato, that word that resonates with the word for womb and gut, as the word for compassion. When he, Jesus, went ashore, he saw a great crowd, and he had compassion for them and cured their sick. Then he ordered the crowds to sit down on the grass. Taking the 5 loaves and the 2 fish, he looked up to heaven and blessed and broke the loaves and gave them to the disciples, and the disciples gave them to the crowds, and all ate and were filled. Let us pray that we may be among those who take the gifts given by the compassion of God and share them with all of our neighbours. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Professor Ford, for your thoughtful presentation. Our third speaker is Professor Dr. Peter Kuzmić.
Thank you. We have heard in our first panel this morning about God, who is eternally loving, loving in his very nature, for it is at the very core of his character to love. The New Testament, shortest definition of the New Testament for God is simply, God is love. I will provide briefly a somewhat more pastoral perspective, for I have been a pastor for a number of years, although I have not always been a Christian, although I was born into a Pentecostal family. But under communism, atheistic education, all kinds of pressures, by the time I entered high school, I claimed to be an atheist, and then I was elected president of the Socialist Youth League, and then my father had to pay consequences. I became a Christian not because somebody rationally persuaded me that that is the truth, but because I watched my father's loving life, how he loved God, how he loved me, his apostate son, and especially how he loved his torturers, who were not lovable but ugly, who threatened to kill him, and how he forgave. That was the strongest evidence for the reality that we are discussing here at our conference. Several brief points. First, God's love aims at mutuality. Ours is a responsive love. We love God because he has loved us first. So loving God is practicing reciprocity. Believing in God in New Testament means trusting Him. God is a trustworthy God because He is loving. Loving God implies, requires, inspires, and deserves our grateful, spontaneous, and joyful response of love. We joyfully celebrate the presence of His love and His life by the Spirit, especially in the Pentecostal charismatic communities. We joyfully celebrate His love and love Him dearly, for knowing God is loving God. Secondly, God's love is benevolently purposeful. Not only benevolently, but persistently purposeful. God intends and seeks what is best for humanity and the world. And so then our love for God is a dedication and engagement to seeing divine purposes accomplished not only in our lives, but in our communities, our nations, and our world. We care lovingly because He does for the well-being of all human beings and for the flourishing of human communities. The loving God wants all human beings to have quality life. Thirdly, loving God, and that's related to this, means working for justice. You see, we have to move beyond. It's a danger to talk about love of God, love of neighbor, because people out there who do not understand our religious language and experience, they may very easily, on the one hand, think we are talking about some theological abstractions and idealism irrelevant to real life, or that it is mere sentimentality. So we must move beyond that to link love to justice, and they are very much biblically related. Some 30 years ago, Mr. Fletcher powerfully reminded us that justice is love distributed. And we have heard at the workshop here earlier at the Yale Divinity School a powerful voice from Africa protesting that we not reduce, as Christians, that we not reduce love to almsgiving. For as he said, love is more than almsgiving. Love is self-giving. Love is changing structures and injustice that impoverishes and enslaves human being. Love is affirming dignity and freedom of conscience of every person, because every person is a bearer of imago Dei, of the image of God. And so it's good to be reminded that God does have a certain preferential love for the poor and the downtrodden, as liberation theologians have reminded us. And loving God, we will respond in order to effectively love our neighbors. Now, fourthly, loving God means forsaking all others. Loving God relativizes all other loves and commitments. There is no room for other gods. No idolatry and no ideology. My concern, as some here in the audience know about many of the conservative evangelical friends here in America, is that very often they turn theology into ideology. And so they ask the question, the first question is, what is right and what is left? Aren't you on the left? And I say, no, this is an ideological question. You should not be asking that question as the first question. The first question should be, what is right and what is wrong? The theological, the ethical question. We love God whom we worship. Love is at the heart of worship. However, our love is easily misdirected, and we worship, or objects of our love become creation, things rather than creator, and we are obsessed and possessed so often by temporal, material, and so on, that we lose sight of the eternal and spiritual. And so easily, both Christian and Muslim, we become idolaters. Love breakers we are more often than law breakers, it seems to me, in light of our theme. And finally, 50, being religious does not necessarily mean being loving. We have to watch and distinguish, not to love our religion more than the living God. The Protestant theologian Karl Barth was a strong prophetic voice for a previous generation, very relevant to us in our world as religion is experiencing in various forms a new renaissance, including the Christian religion. If knowing God and loving God are correlated, we both in our communities have to ask how many of the 3 billion plus of our adherents really know God and love Him. How many of them can be God's transformative agents in our broken world, motivated by God's love? A Croatian politician recently told me, a high-ranking politician, he said, "Don't talk about Jesus. I don't have time for Bible and prayer. I am a Christian because I am Croatian." And in the post-communist world, we have a lot of ethnic Christianity that would not feel comfortable talking about loving God and loving neighbor, and Christianity has been abused. I felt like apologizing to my Muslim friends in Bosnia, who were the most loving people, and the way their image was distorted and in an almost medieval fashion, with a cross in one hand and a sword in another. Their women were raped and their worship places destroyed. I, as a Christian, felt that we, as Christian communities, have betrayed our God, who is a loving God. We have in Europe a lot of religion. You travel to Germany and you will see Gothic cathedrals everywhere, standing empty as mute witnesses to what appears to be a dying faith. Do the people in Europe who are culturally Christian, and there is a cross and there are the bells and there are the towers everywhere, are they truly believing, trusting God? Are they capable of loving the neighbor as themselves if they don't love God? So we have to examine what that means, for maybe in both of our communities we deal with magnitudes, with large numbers, majorities of practical atheists, although they claim to belong to our religion. They, if not practical atheists, then people who are indifferent to loving God and loving neighbor. Let me say, this conference is a conference of hope. And I do personally want to thank the Yale Divinity School and the Center for Faith and Culture, but first of all my Muslim friends, for taking the wise, bold, benevolent step through common word. Hope is the ability to listen to the music of the future. There is a desired future. We could all write a script. Hope is the ability to listen to the music of the future. Faith is the courage to dance to it in the present. Let us be God's transformative agent in our broken world. Let us dance lovingly and joyfully to the music of the future. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Peter Kuzmić. Now we'll listen to Rabbi Oxman.
I want to begin by thanking His Excellency Prince Razi, Dr. Saperstein, Reverend Cummings for including me here, making me a part of this conference and allowing me to speak. But I think more so I want to acknowledge my co-panelists. It's, for some especially, it's an act of leadership, if not courage as well, that they're even sitting alongside me and sharing the same stage. It's a significant act. It's an act that says that they're here not to import the strife and the hatred of politics into religion. Instead, their presence here is to export the love of God into politics. And I'm very grateful and honored that you sit alongside me. It could be intimidating. In fact, it is a little intimidating for me to speak here before you. Not because I'm Jewish, not because I'm a rabbi, but after listening to all the speakers who came before me and listening to the speakers of this morning, I know, and that's going to be no surprise to you shortly, I'm not an academician. I'm not a scholar. I'm not a theologian. In fact, certainly if you ask my children, I'm not particularly bright or intelligent, although my oldest son would say that I learned an awful lot in the 4 years from when he was 21 to 25. But that's okay. I'm not making apologies for who I am, because I'm exactly as God created me. God had a purpose in creating me, and He created me according to His will. And as a Jew, I pray 3 times a day. And each time that I'm praying, amongst the things that I say, the following verse. I'm repeating the commandment that I need to love the Lord, my God, with all my heart, with all my soul, and with all my might. Now the question is, how does an average person like me make sense of that? I already stipulated what my credentials were not. If anything, I'm like the average man in the street. And I would say that the discord that we see around us today are not from the leaders such as yourselves. It's from people like me, people who follow others, not the leaders themselves. So I turned to the Jewish sages. One's name was Rabbi Akiva, and in asked that question, he responded with a verse from Leviticus chapter 19. It's been repeated here in one form or another. V'ahavta l're'echa kamocha. He says, you want to serve God? You want to love God? You have to love your neighbor as yourself. Another one of our sages was asked to stand on one foot, which I'm doing in front of you. Standing on one foot, how would you summarize what it means to be a Jew? What it means to serve God? What it means to love God? And he responded from Leviticus, don't do unto others what you would not want them to do to you. It's just the flip side. Treat other people with love, they'll treat you with love. If you're hurtful to other people, can you expect anything other than hurt to come back to you? And so why do we say this? Why do we connect loving God and loving our fellow human beings? And our sages teach us, and as we've heard before, it was God that created this world. And when we read in the book of Genesis, Bereshit, the first book of the Torah, and it's God who separated the waters from the firmament, and it's God who created the waters that were teeming with life and brought forth vegetation and insects and birds and animals and populated the entire world with them. But when it came time to creating human beings, God only created one single human being, Adam, the first man. And why was it? If God could create vegetation throughout the entire world and could fill the seas with fish and with plankton and with other living microorganisms and could cover the land with animals and the skies filled with birds throughout the entire world, why is it only one person? And that's because we are all equal in God's eyes. We're all God's children. We all descend from that single human being. I am no better than you. You are no better than me. But collectively, we are all great because we were created by God for exactly how God wants us to be. If God wanted the entire world to be Jewish, God would have made the world Jewish. So it must be God's will that we have Jews, and that we have Muslims, and that we have Christians. God only asks of us to acknowledge God. Show our love by God by looking around at the wonders and the majesty around us and recognizing from where that comes from. That comes from God, and each of us fulfills His will by relating to Him in the way that He has given to us, because He is our collective Father. I know time is short, so I'll be brief. My daughter got married last summer. Child number 2, first one to get married, daddy's little girl going away from home. And I love my son-in-law. Why? Because when I look in my daughter's eyes, they're beaming. She's smiling. I had an opportunity to see them last week. She is so happy. My son-in-law loves me. How do I know that? Because look what he's doing for my daughter, and she is a part of me. She is my child, and each and every moment that he invests in making her happy, that's an act of love for me. That's what Rabbi Akiva was teaching. That's what Hillel is teaching. That's what Scripture is teaching. We all are children of God. God is our collective parent. If we want to love God, and we want to show our devotion to God, we only need to turn to one another and say, we'll leave the politics out of religion, and instead, we'll export the love of our faith into politics. Because when we show love for one another, we are recognizing that we are all God's children. We are bringing joy to God's heart. We are showing our devotion by simply loving His creatures. We treat them as we would want ourselves to be treated. Look at each and every one of us as a child of God. Relate to each and every one of us as a child of God. And that's how we express our love for our Father. Thank you very much for your having me.
Thank you very much, Rabbi Waxman, for a wonderful presentation. And now we'll listen to our last speaker, His Excellency Shaykh Naim Ternava, Grand Mufti of Kosovo.
Bismillah.
In the name of God, most gracious, may glory be to God Almighty. Mr. Moderator, dear audience, I'm very glad as a citizen of Kosovo and as the representative of the Muslims in Kosovo to stand before you and to greet you in the name of the Islamic Union in Kosovo State. And I am honored by attending this international gathering which is taking place here in the United States and which was organized in cooperation between Yale University and the Royal Al Bayt Institute for Islamic Thought from the Hashemite Kingdom of Jordan. I am also glad that I have the opportunity to address you with few words about my country, about my state, Kosovo, the most modern state in Europe and in the world. And because of the presence of many scholars and researchers in different fields from other countries, and who already know the problems of the world more than I do, their presence in this hall, I would like to concentrate in my word on religion's future vision and the role of religion in society and among individuals. The subject of religion today is present in all sectors of society and in political events as well. And as you know, many of the problems that the world faces today are attributed to the mistrust between the adherents of the different faiths and religions, or to the misuse of religious teachings for the sake of achieving political and economic benefits. Therefore, studying these problems from the religious point of view will help in removing these obstacles and problems. These problems always appear every now and then in the Balkan region, but also in all over the world. And that's because of the ignorance of the role and the duty that religion has to play in society. Dear audience, all of us know the persecution and the suffering that the people in Kosovo has faced during the last decades in the 20th century. This suffering, which we know, we also feel it. We, the representatives of Muslims in Kosovo, we were always close to all sectors of society at all times, and therefore, based on previous experiences, I can say with all confidence that the role of the representatives of religion and the religions is to be committed to the teaching and basics of religion and to concentrate on loving God and to spread love among people regardless of color, language or belief. In addition, we have, by addressing society, we have to plant and spread love, respect and happy life in society. This is all part of the values that the monotheistic religions spread. Getting away from religious values and not applying them has made our societies misunderstand each other. And instead of respecting each other, we actually are in conflict with each other, even though outwardly we may say that we respect one another, or even though we may call for peace. Faith, love, and sincere responsibility towards God will motivate man to respect his neighbor, and Islam commands us to have many responsibilities towards our neighbors, like paying visits to them, cooperating with them, greeting them, helping them. All of these are different ways and methods that will make man respect and love neighbors regardless of their religion and beliefs. The people of Kosovo, even the people of Kosovo cannot offer much in the area of science or technology or economy. Nevertheless, Kosovo, even though it's small, can present its experience in peaceful coexistence and mutual respect among different denominations. By respecting one another and coexist in understanding and harmony. Therefore, dear audience, I think that many areas in the world today may benefit from our experience, which enrich the Albanians and by which the Albanians consider as dignity to it. And out of this experience, the Islamic Union, as well as the Albanian Catholic Church, have offered their contribution in stability and peaceful dialogue among religions, in addition to affirming respect and good neighborhood. And this is evidenced in the preparedness by all parties when the international conference, which is called Religions for Peace, and its headquarters in New York, when it started in March 1999, which was held under the leadership of Rabbi Schneier, it started applying religious dialogue in Kosovo as one of the means to reduce tension and restore confidence among the different denominations in Kosovo. Therefore, the Islamic Union in Kosovo, and for the sake of bringing together Serbs and Albanians for a better life, and in order and based on the Islamic teachings, the Islamic Union has always supported all initiatives, and especially for the interest of the citizens of Kosovo, regardless of religious affiliation. As a result, there were many meetings and dialogues and mutual dialogues have been held between the three denominations, Muslims, Catholics, and Orthodox. And many committees have been formed as representatives for these three denominations. Sessions were held in Vienna and Amman in 1999, in 2000 in Pristina, in 2001 in Oslo, in 2003 in Sarajevo, in 2004 Brussels, in 2005 Pristina, in Istanbul and Tirana, in 2006 also in the Orthodox Church. In all these meetings, common statements were signed to bring people closer together for a better life for all. And these meetings were evaluated, and we saw that they were very fruitful. Peace is very important for humanity, and religion, Islam religion, commands us to have peace, and this is very clear in God's book, where God says, all those who have believed seek peace and don't listen to Satan. Therefore, it's not a surprise when God says that all people, regardless of their religion or ethnic group, all of them have been created from one person, and therefore they should have mutual respect. Whereby God says, "O people, we have created you from male and female, and we have made you peoples and tribes to get to know each other. The most righteous of you is the ones who believe in God." And because peace and peaceful coexistence, as well as mutual respect among people, and because there is mutual dialogue, there must be some kind of respect and appreciation between religions. In addition, this requires continual cooperation, sincerity, and lack of hypocrisy. We should have some activities in the area of scientific research on condition of respecting human rights. We should also combat organized crime, whatever its kind. We should also have common activities in fighting terrorism, in combating drugs, and in combating serious diseases that threaten human society. A mutual dialogue will reduce poverty and the number of poor people in the world. It will also help in eradicating illiteracy and to spread the teachings and solve many problems. We, as leaders and religious leaders and representatives of religions, we have to raise our voice high before the decision-making sentence, and we should address our governments, and we should tell them of the problems that people face, and especially man faces, man, the most honorable of God's creation. It's very sad to see many children die out of hunger, while there's a lot of spending of money on continual arms. And in conclusion, allow me to address the participants in this meeting whose countries have not acknowledged the state of Kosovo. I address them and I appeal them to recognize the state of Kosovo as soon as possible. And especially I address the Islamic countries, which is the Islamic Conference Organization in Jeddah, and I appeal to them to take this step, which will mean a lot to the people of Kosovo as well as the people of Kosovo. Thank you very much in advance, and thank you very much.